All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's episode as we delve into these pivotal developments
Mm.
that are really reshaping the economy and certainly the political landscape. I'm Randy Dewey, your host, president of CEO Coaching International, and today we're going to explore the significant implications of President Trump's recent tariff announcement and some of the ensuing international responses. So I'd like to set the stage for the discussion, and then we'll introduce my esteemed panelists. So, for context, on February 1st, 2025, President Trump announced the imposition of tariffs aimed at addressing national concerns over illegal immigration and, of course, drug trafficking. He made some grand promises, of course, during his election campaign as he was priming the market for some changes that were going to come if he was the one to win. And some of those plans were certainly meant imposing tariffs as a means of curtailing these undocumented migrants and as well stopping the flow of illegal fentanyl through economic pressure. The Trump administration, since the election, since he's won the election, certainly contended that these financial incentives will really force compliance to the request. However, tariffs have far-reaching implications, and the specific tariffs that were announced for Canada, it meant a 25% tariff on all imports, with Canadian oil and energy products subjected to a lesser tariff at 10%. Mexico was a 25% tariff on all imports, and China was a 10% tariff on all imports. It is expected today he's going to make another announcement on aluminum and steel products at around 25%, but that is yet to be announced. So these measures are supposed to take effect on February 4th, representing a significant shift in U.S. trade policy, particularly concerning these close trading partners. And this is, of course, these are the top three trading partners for the U.S. for many, many years. Canada and Mexico were able to get in there early on and almost put a pause and for 30 days through some of the concessions they made quickly with sending troops and doing some other things, which I'll speak about in a moment, which really then kind of delays the imposing of those tariffs until March the 4th, 2025. So following the agreement that they had. So we got about 26 days left before we see what the final decision is and the final announcements on these things and what concessions have been made and changes that will be imposed. So the retaliatory actions, though, that were immediately announced came from both Canada and Mexico and China. So in Canada's part, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau declared a 25% tariff on about $155 billion worth, which is about half, not quite half of the total that they have coming into Canada from the United States. So it's about half of it is now going to impose this tariff. They also then came with a response that they would have a fentanyl SAR, and as well as they would have that joint strike force task that would combat organized crime. So that bought some time for Mr. Trudeau to negotiate for the next 30 days. On Mexico's side, President Claudia Sheinbaum announced that Mexico would implement retaliatory tariffs, but less clear on exactly how much. Somewhere between 5 and 20% was inferred on things like pork and cheese and fresh produce and manufactured steel and aluminum. She criticized, of course, the U.S. tariffs as being unjust and called for collaborative efforts to address, to address these sort of shared challenges. President Scheinbaum deployed 10,000 National Guard troops to the border to help address the drug and illegal immigration issue. China, on the other hand, had a lesser tariff, 10%. However, they announced that they were rejecting this assertion. And of course, they reject the assertion that they were responsible for the flow of fentanyl in the US. And they've now pled to the World Trade Organization on their behalf. But they have imposed a 15% tariff on US coal and liquefied natural gas and a 10% tariff on US oil and agricultural machinery, which in fact takes place today. So as we begin, it's important to recognize that Canada, Mexico, and China are really the top three trading partners that they've held this status. These three countries comprise of 45% of all imports to the United States and totaling well over $2 trillion of trade, a significant impact for their three largest trading partners. Mexico is number one trading partner to the United States with $840 billion of bilateral trade. They're deeply woven together, intricate supply chains between the two countries, of course, in manufacturing, electronic goods, and food production, automotive. But it constitutes about 15% of the US's imports, where it also actually is 78% 8% of Mexico's exports. So a very significant export impact for Mexico when their largest trading partners impose this sort of tariff. Not dissimilar to Canada. Canada's number two at $762 billion. It constitutes 14% of the United States' imports and 77% of Canada's exports. So again, significant impact. Slightly less for China, being number three. They have about $583 billion of trade, which is 11% of the US's imports, but 16% of China's exports. So less of an impact, but certainly from an economic perspective, it still has significant impact on China's economy. So, but in theory, Canada and Mexico have the most significant impact to their GDP, will have the most significant impact to their largest trading partner in that trade relationship. There has been some political fallout from these actions that'll be significant. Obviously, allies and trading partners for decades are expressing strong opposition to these agreements. The situation has led to heightened sort of political tensions and diplomatic tensions between the countries. So, with that said, I'd like to introduce the panel that we brought and put together for today's discussion. I'd like to introduce each of the panelists, give them an opportunity to just give their name, their title, where they were, and a brief background. That'd be great, and then we'll jump into the discussion. So, with that said, I'd like to introduce Jason Drejo. Jason, could you introduce yourself?
All right, thank you, Randy, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm at UBS Global Wealth Management. Within the organization, we have a chief investment office, and in that, I'm responsible for asset allocation in the U.S. and driving a lot of our investment strategy, which means kind of formulating kind of the overall investment and economic views, top down, taking into consider economic trends, policy trends, as like was the topic today, then formulating well based on that, like how do we want to allocate across different asset classes and make investment decisions. So I can tell you right now that's really tariffs and all of a lot of Trump policies are kind of front and center of everything that we're thinking about in terms of the economic implications, the investment implications. So it's certainly a timely topic today.
Awesome, and thank you, Jason. Welcome. Also, like to introduce Sanu Varghese. Sanu.
Realize I was on mute. You'd think I'd get used to that. No, thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. Sonu Varghese, I'm Vice President, Global Macro Strategist at Carson Group. We work closely with, Carson Wealth. We have about 500 advisors around the country. And I lead our asset allocation team. We manage several models with a strategic investment models, tactical models, all of that. So we're always thinking about, how the global economy, the US economy and policy, whether it's monetary policy, fiscal policy, how that interacts with markets, what that means, and how we, try to convert that into our Carson House views and implement that into portfolios. So, as Jason said, tariffs are front and center, but also the downstream effects of that. What does that mean for monetary policy? What does that mean for the Federal Reserve? Which is, I think part of a big part of the conversation and the uncertainty created around that. So all of this is something we're thinking about and writing about. I have a podcast that I do with my colleague Ryan Dietrich as well, Facts versus Feelings. It's available on Apple and Spotify and all those places, YouTube too. We just spent an hour talking about tariffs on the latest episode too. So yeah, this is front and
Big
center.
topic for the day, no doubt.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, Sanu. John Seliger, you could come in. John's a CEO coach with our firm. Spent 30 years in China, so there's lots of context there. John, introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. Happy to be here. Yeah, as Randy said, I spent much of my adult life and professional career in China specifically, but throughout Asia. As it relates to this topic, I ran several multinational brands that were importing into China in the luxury retail space. So it was very much, obviously with landed goods costing and transfer prices was very much involved in tariff discussions. Towards the end of my time in China, I was working with several private equity firms where we were navigating the Trump 1.0 trade war and sort of helping our clients and our portfolio companies navigate the waters then. Today is a very different situation. China has a lot more tools in its toolbox, which we may get to on this call. We'll see how what announcements are made in the next couple of weeks and months are going to be responded by China.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I'd like to introduce Edward Hughes. Edward.
Thanks for having me here, Randy. I'm going to say good morning. I'm in San Diego, right next to the Mexican border. After this meeting, I literally leave, go to the airport, and fly to Toronto. So a lot of relevant topics on this. Before being a partner and coach at CEO Coaching, I was a CEO for 20 years in the specialty chemical business, sporting goods business. I stood up facilities in Mexico. I now have 4 clients in Canada. So this is a very hot and relevant topic for a lot of people I work with.
Super. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your time today. If anyone has any questions, please type those questions into the chat. We are going to try and get to as many questions as possible because obviously that's where everybody's head is at and what the type of questions I really want to get understood and be able to take away from this. But before we dive into some of the questions from the audience, maybe I can zoom out and keep out for a moment here. Jason, if I could just turn to you and ask you, how do you anticipate the tariffs will actually affect consumer prices in the US? Because it's not like all the goods go up 25%. Those costs will end up finding their way back to the pocketbooks of the consumers. But just love to hear what your feeling is on how the implication on consumer prices in the US ought to be responding to this.
Well, it's going to depend on the magnitude of like what tariffs are actually implemented. Because if you think about what's been announced and implemented thus far, it is an incremental 10% tariff on imports from China, which is on top of the tariffs that were put in place during Trump 1.0. So it's not just 10%. Some cases it might be up to like 35%. That incremental impact on inflation, if there's nothing else, will be relatively contained on average. If we start having 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, the numbers you gave at the start, just that's aggregate. Now you're talking almost 50% of all imports into the U.S. So that will start to be, more material. From a context perspective, if we're looking at different inflation gauges, let's use the inflation gauge that the Fed cares most about, which is something called PCE inflation, not the CPI that gets kind of mostly widely published. And you strip out food and energy, so you focus on the core elements. Right now, it's at about 2.8% if you measure sort of year over year. It's likely, absent any tariffs, to kind of drift a little bit lower as the year goes on. So the question is, how would tariffs change this aggregate number? Rough ballpark figure, if we talk about the tariffs, like what was announced last week but not fully implemented, you could be looking at about a 0.5 percentage point increase in the inflation rate. And estimates vary. Like there's no precise modeling. So I've seen some estimates say as low as 20 or 30 basis points. Other estimates going up to a full percentage point. This is again an average. It's also something that's a bit of a one-time step change, meaning you have the increase in price. It's like you raise your sales tax effectively. Then once you do that, and then you kind of level set at a new price level, the inflation rate can actually fall. So it's sort of a bit of a bump, and then by next year, as we kind of move forward, the inflation rate can actually kind of start to fall back to where it would have been otherwise, assuming it doesn't really sort of alter the overall inflation projections. So that's the average. Now, of course, the average sort of belies the reality that some areas would be hit hard and you'd see significant price increases, and others where there's goods would basically not be impacted at all. I can give you like one example, like softwood lumber. It's a major import from Canada. There's been tensions between the two countries, back to the 80s on softwood lumber. But currently, I think softwood lumber from Canada is about 30 to 35% of all lumber, like softwood lumber used in the US. It's critical to, home construction. You think about like, LA and Los Angeles, like that area, like how much reconstruction has to happen. If you don't have an easy substitute, and there's no real easy way for US producers to ramp up and, substitute for that, you essentially have, the prices of those goods going up across the board. So you could see 10, 15% increase in the price of softwood lumber in a very short order. The same could apply for other goods. So in situations for those specific products hit, and when there's limited substitution, either in the U.S. or other markets or other importers or countries that export to the U.S., you're going to just see a bigger price impact. So you could see almost a full 25% and some companies say, I think in regards to like the steel imports, and others would say or tariffs, that you will just pass on the entire price. Like it's just going to go right to maybe 25%. So it's the average of like what I talked about, 50 basis points, that really belies the fact that if you are in an industry that's impacted, it could be much, much more significant versus the overall economic impact.
Mm. And Sanu, tariffs aren't a new thing. Obviously, there's been tariffs used by many countries all over the world over the years, and as well even in the U.S. In times past. But I think it's the quantum of the tariffs, along with the quickness of the tariffs and how broad brushing they are. What do you feel like the impacts are going to be on the economies of the 4 countries as a result of just how abrupt and how significant the magnitude is?
I mean, by itself on the surface, the US is not a big exporter, which is not to say U.S. manufacturing is insignificant. It is about 12% of the economy. I mean, that is, fairly significant, but it matters more to, you mentioned for Mexico, exports to the U.S. make up close to 80%, right? So, and manufacturing is a bigger piece of Mexico's economy. It's a bigger piece of China's economy, as well as, Europe, places like Germany and all of those. And for Canada, it's really about, a large part of it is crude oil too, right? So there is that piece of it, and with respect to how prices impacted. So with respect to the economies, I think there's a question on the dollar as well, so I'll bring that in. And something Jason mentioned, back in 2018, if you look at even the personal consumption expenditures index, if you look at the components, things like sporting goods, household appliances, on which tariffs were imposed, stuff coming from China especially, prices rose, right? But it was a step change. It was a one-time increase. And then we didn't see inflation. But the backdrop was we were already in a fairly low inflationary environment. So it didn't impact it too much, right? Everything else sort of countered that, at least on average. Now, this time, I think we are in a slightly different environment. And one thing we are watching is how will companies respond to, the intermediate cost of goods going up, right? Back in 2018, there were a lot of tariffs on intermediate goods, not on consumer end goods too. But those prices a lot of times didn't get passed down to consumers, right? Whereas this time, we just saw in 21, 22, we tracked, something called a producer price index that also contains margin information for retailers and wholesalers. A lot of them actually passed down intermediate price increases to the end consumer, and we saw prices go up. That's why inflation is close to about 9%. Wasn't entirely margin increases, but a big chunk of it was, right? So we are in that environment where companies may be like, okay, we can do a price over volume approach, and we can, increase prices, pass those costs down to the consumers. That's when we'll really get inflation, right? So it's just a matter of, how the environment changes. I think with respect to the dollar, it's ultimately dependent on how much, an increase in the dollar really affects the U.S. economy versus everyone else. Like I said, the U.S. dollar makes manufacturing exports more expensive. So it doesn't impact a huge chunk of the U.S. economy. So I don't think there'll be a big drag on economic growth from that perspective. But we are seeing, if you want an acceleration of the cyclical part of the economy, you need, a weaker dollar, because you want manufacturing to go, like just over the last 6 months, manufacturing jobs fell 79,000, right? Despite the economy creating 1 million jobs, right? So that is an example where the stronger dollar, higher interest rates make an adverse impact on the economy. With respect to the rest of the globe, I think, the fact that the dollar is strong already tells you that growth is relatively weak outside the US than, the US, right? So I think the dollar going up doesn't help anyone. It does now, I think, mute the inflationary impact of the tariffs in some way. Just take the China 10% tariffs, right? Over the last 2 years, the Chinese yuan has gone down 10%. So it's almost like a complete wash in that respect, right? So that's how we look at it. You have to include the effects of the currency as well when you think about the inflationary impact of these things.
John, when you looked at the responses, Canada came quickly with their retaliatory tariffs, and then Mexico came second, but then all of a sudden there was this 30 days delay that was imposed. So China's response wasn't maybe as abrupt and as quick. Obviously, their tariffs weren't as high, but it has significant consequences. You alluded to in your introduction some of the other levers that China may pull. Love to get your contact on, is China coming back quickly, and is there what do you think some of the things are that we ought to be concerned about or watching for?
Yeah, sure. I think this time around, China is in no rush to engage in a tit for tat, a really escalation of a tit for tat situation with the U.S. because on the U.S. side there is leverage, and I think there is this is a moment in time. Whereas the trade deficit really hasn't changed. I think it's actually increased in China's favor since the first trade war. That having been said, since then, and due to COVID and other reasons, the Chinese domestic economy has significantly slowed and is struggling. So there is an over-reliance now, an over-indexing on exports and manufacturing currently in the Chinese economy that I think plays very well into this strategy that the Trump administration is trying to trying to execute. That having been said, as I was saying before, I think the Chinese have over the last sort of 5 years have really prepared themselves for these sort of contingencies to mitigate the risk. So as of now, the China does more trade in renminbi and the Chinese yuan than they do with US dollars globally. They do more trade with the global South in their own currency than with the US and the entire developed West currently, and that is a trend that's continuing to grow. They have, I believe, something like 85 or 90% control over key rare earths and rare earth processing. They have continued to develop that leverage over the last 5, 6 years that are really important as components for several technological industries and products. Solar and solar components. They've been buying unbelievably cheap oil from Russia since the start of the Ukraine war, lowering their reliance on especially U.S. Oil. And I think they've also developed less dependence on U.S. ag. So, all of those, trade war 1.0 commitments on soybeans and other agricultural products, they don't necessarily have the domestic need to go after those as they did in the first one. So I think they're taking a much more measured wait and see approach. I think they see this administration as far less strategic, more transactional, and waiting to kind of get in the room with President Trump, with Xi Jinping, to see where some of this lands.
Edward, on your way to Canada right after this call, what are some of the sort of the things that you're contending with? What are some of the areas that the tariffs are having potential impacts, or what kind of strategies are you considering and helping your clients work through in this situation?
Well, as you said at the start, this is a very rapidly evolving situation. We have also seen the announcement and then the pause, and then hey, we'll see what kind of deal we're going to get. So I don't think it's clear what the long term is going to be on these tariffs. I think, President Trump is very transactional in that. He's looking for a deal. He views any trade imbalance as unjust, and so if there's a way to balance it out, he's probably going to be fine. So, I look at this from a couple of perspectives with my clients. One is, pricing, right? What happens if your costs are going up? This is an opportunity. We saw this with COVID, other situations where you now have air cover and justification for taking pricing where normally you don't. And the second thing is, what are you going to do on your supply chain that if you are disproportionately getting products from Canada or from Mexico, can you rebalance it, either onshore it here so you've got a supply chain that's robust? But this can be an opportunity. As I say, when I was a CEO and COVID happened, we could take pricing, and instead of the usual pushback from our customers, they used to give us tremendous pushback. They would say, "Hey, everybody's doing it. We're just going to pass it on." So I think we got to see how this thing plays out. They may all come to an agreement in 30, 60 days from now, and everybody's fine. But focus on your pricing, take it where you can, and then make sure your supply chain has got some balance here and diversified.
Jason, I'd love to get your thoughts on this comment. Tariffs have the potential implication of resorting the trading relationships with many nations, the resorting of certain supply chains. And on the global level, how do you feel that the tariffs will influence that global supply chain in the coming weeks and months ahead?
Well, I'd approach it in a couple of ways. One is in the context of the U.S., Canada, Mexico, given that there is a trade deal among the three countries that was signed under Trump 1.0, is set to be reviewed next year, and there is a view among some people certainly that the part of the threat of 25% tariffs now is to sort of force those countries to the table to kind of renegotiate sooner. One of the issues I think that will be a point of contention, and perhaps where Canada and the U.S. will be quite aligned on this, is the rules of origin, because since Trump 1.0, you've seen imports, from China to the U.S. dropped a lot. But what it does seem like, and then there's, it varies depending on the industry. What they've done is, okay, fine, we'll do a lot of assembly in China, do final assembly, say in Vietnam, and then go to the U.S. You avoid the tariff that way. Mexico is an obvious beneficiary of that. And so the question of well, what's the real client? What is the value add in terms of these, of things being assembled in Mexico, or countries? China as an example, using that as just a way to get around the tariff. So I think this is relevant in terms of the supply chains, because the extent that that the U.S. and Canada sort of united with them, sort of alter that, could say, well, it's not just a final assembly in Mexico, but you actually need to really relocate a bulk of the supply chain, to North America. So I think that's something that is, to be determined, but I think that'll be in some way probably a key sticking point in the renegotiations that will occur for that trade deal. And I'm assuming the trade deal will be negotiated. That's just the tariffs are kind of like a constant, the hammer and the carrot and stick. This is to stick to get sort of renegotiations. So that's one thing. And comments that John and Edward kind of made in terms of Trump being very transactional. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, his history tells us that. But I think it's also a little bit wrong to think in terms of that it's purely transactional. And maybe Trump's approach is that just his nature, but I think there is an underlying philosophy among some of his advisors of how they're thinking about all these trade kind of deals, and it's much more strategic in the sense that if you look at if the world's evolving to this multipolar world of the U.S., China, perhaps Russia, the Eurozone, that having influence and spheres of influence become critical. You can kind of weave in discussions about the Panama Canal and Greenland. Sometimes they seem a little bit, is this serious or not? But conceptually, there seems to be an element like where the administration and some advisors feel like the U.S. needs to project strength. It needs to be secure. It needs access to certain resources where it gets it. And part of these trade deals will be aligned with sort of securing those resources. Look, the past few years, there's been two hot wars that, one is for the moment on ceasefire in the Middle East in Gaza, another that could, potentially come to an end at some point this year in Ukraine. The U.S. has been supplying a lot of military, and in some sense, their military supplies have been depleted to some extent. If you are worrying strategically about the geopolitical threat of China, you can't actually produce enough military armaments. You need to change supply chains and access to resources. So I think there's this broader strategic, imperative that is going on. How much that actually drives a lot of what's done is remains to be seen. Ultimately, if Trump just does transactional deals, it may not shift it. But I say all this in the context of that. If you take that more strategic perspective, then some of the reshifting of supply chains, especially in critical industries and semiconductors, is one that Trump talked about. Tariffs on Taiwan, which is a pure tax because the only place that produces some of these semiconductors is Taiwan. But the whole goal of perhaps is moving some production here or to a safer region. So I think that all these things are very much in play. There's probably a shorter term impact, like next 1 or 2 years, and maybe a version of this is a 5 or 10 year perspective, kind of going on. And looking just purely transactional might lose sight of the bigger picture of what some people, at least in the administration and advisors to Trump, are kind of thinking strategically. So a lot of rewiring the pace of it and where it's going to evolve. But I think this is the overarching theme that is something to kind of keep in mind.
One last question here, Simon, before we turn to the audience's questions, which are certainly very tactical questions. Curious, Trump is notorious for tipping his hand, and he does it purposely to make sure that everybody kind of knows what's coming next and goes quiet on it. And he's talked about the EU tariffs, and but in the case of China, Mexico, and Canada, is related to undocumented immigrants and drugs. That's the sort of the card that he's playing needs to be addressed. What do you think it is for the EU and tariffs related to that?
I think it goes back to a point Jason mentioned. I mean, there is the transactional nature of it, especially Mexico and Canada wanting the border security piece as part of that deal. I think there's a trade piece of it too. But I think going back to something, President Trump has always wanted, he's always thought trade deficits are bad for the US, right?
Yeah.
The US is being taken advantage of because we have trade deficits. We buy a lot from other countries. The US does. So one thing I'll be watching is on that point about Europe, we know the tariffs, some announcement on Europe is going to come. Steel and aluminum will be part of that. It's already going. And then, reciprocal tariffs don't matter too much because the U.S., developed countries don't impose a lot of tariffs. It's going to be more problematic with places like India and other, emerging markets. But, one thing to watch is how do these, deals get negotiated, and what are the verification mechanisms within them once they are negotiated, both for security and trade, right? And case in point, after the trade war 2018, 2019, the US signed a deal with China, the phase 1 trade deal, and China completely reneged on all those agreements, right? There was no enforcement mechanisms. They were supposed to buy, I don't know, close to about $200 billion in US manufactured goods, and they barely came to about 50% of that, right? So what is the consequence this time around, right? Even if whether you are transactional or more strategic, there will have to be like the carrot and stick approach. And the question is, what's the stick here, right?
Mhm.
The carrot is, okay, we won't impose tariffs on you, right? But what's the stick if you don't agree to it, right? So that's I think that's something to watch. I think border security will be part of that, but I think trade will be, how much more can you buy from us, as opposed to us buying more from you. I think that's goes to something probably that is deep,
Yeah.
in President Trump's core, going back to the 80s. He wanted tariffs in Japan at the time, right?
Mhm.
It's just the targets have changed right now.
Well, with all that's going on with the Ukraine war and Putin, and of course with Trump's sort of some of the declarations he's made there, then you've got Germany and some instability in government in the UK. There's a lot of issues around NATO spending and getting and bolstering some of the defense. So I'm sure there's going to be a certain angle there that he's going to be leveraging for spending and protecting because he's tired of being the police of the world, as he said many times. And so with that comes a price tag. If you're not going to do it, then I'm going to charge you for it. So that's certainly going to play into it. Let's turn to the audience's question, and maybe John, I'll have you field the first one. How should small and medium-sized businesses prepare for the cost increases caused by tariffs, especially if they're heavily reliant upon importing goods? What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, I mean, I think similar to what Edward said, this could be an opportunity. So there's an opportunity to look at your merchandising mix, look at your current price positioning in general to see if there are opportunities to, move up prices in general. It's a good opportunity to look at that. To go deeper into your supply chain, I think it's always good to diversify your supply chain. So, I mean, I'll just tell a story. When I was running the coach business in Asia, in 2010, we were making about 50 million handbags a year in China from a number of service providers, number of facilities. Um, we sort of saw the writing on the wall, and we shifted a lot of that production to other countries, Vietnam, to Thailand. About 85% of that production went into uh, Thailand and Vietnam, and mostly Vietnam. We moved about 250 people and closed offices in Hong Kong and Guangzhou, China, and moved them to Ho Chi Minh City. But that having been said, 100% of those factories that were open that we moved our capacity to were all Chinese owned, right? They were just moving their base of operations from southern China to these other countries. I was later on the board of a apparel fashion supply chain management company, and it was the same story. All of the service providers that were setting up in Laos and Cambodia and Indonesia were all Chinese or kind of local Chinese joint ventures. So it's kind of this giant head fake. But if you have relationships with the Chinese, with your current Chinese suppliers, and you want to explore with them opportunities to mitigate the risk and look at even lower cost operations, countries of origin, then now's a great time to do that because the decoupling has been going on for years, and these Chinese factories and manufacturers are more than ready, to welcome you in Vietnam and Cambodia and elsewhere, and they have an amazing ability to do, high mix, low volume manufacturing for almost, every category that's consumer facing. So I think now's a great time to really do a deeper dive on supply chain to see where you can kind of get advantages.
Right. So when you think about some of the 3PLs and some of the
Mhm.
repatriation of some manufacturing and where things are in the supply chain, that could certainly change. Things may be sent more in a rawer form, so they're less subjected to tariffs versus a finished goods form. So supply chain reconsiderations are certainly going to be extremely helpful in times like this where you have changes.
Yeah, and I'd say just that, if you're currently working with Chinese suppliers, don't feel that you obligatorily have to go outside of Chinese suppliers because those Chinese suppliers are already operating all over the world, right? And they are more than ready to welcome your business, but through, different countries of origin.
Yes. 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 Jason, turn to you. What would be the feasible timeline or perspective to these Trump initiatives could bring impact to business? So I think the question from the audience is, what kind of timeline, like say that it's announced, and let's say it's to the fullest extent as he's outlined, and there's not as much that can be done to minimize it. When would we start to see the major impacts of that?
In terms of the economic impact for this
Yeah, the
inflation
economic.
growth, I think so for inflation, it could start to show up within a few months. Yeah, like we saw that back in 2018, 19. Like that happens, pretty quick. It depends on the goods and the inventory cycles, things of that sort. But I'd say if tariffs were to be imposed on Canada, Mexico, just pick as a hypothetical, on March 4th, by May, you could, if not sooner, you could see it to start to show up in actual prices and then inflation data, at the same time. So I think we're talking, a matter of a few months. In terms of the economic impact, the growth impact is probably a little more of a lag because you sort of like adjust prices right away. Then you have to figure out like, well, if you want to shut down production, alter production, that takes a little more time. But I think that also we're talking maybe a couple of more months, but relatively kind of quick overall from the announcement of tariffs to the negative consequences. Ultimately, a tariff is you're imposing a tax that's going to alter the cost of production, and therefore that reduces maybe demand. It reduces like how much you want to produce. The longer term consequences of the tariffs, thinking about like if the goal is to bring back manufacturing and production to the U.S., that's a much longer time frame. Like that, you could be looking at 18 to 24 months. I've heard that from of the autos, which would be very significant impact in terms of production within Canada, that you cannot retool these auto factories, in sort of less than 18 to 24 months. So what you're left with is higher prices, probably less demand, kind of less production before you can start to kind of rejigger things. So it's a little bit of, the negative economic pain comes relatively quickly, like I'd say, in a matter of months, depending on exact good. Any potential benefits longer term could vary.
Yeah, just one second, John. When you think about the how extensive it is for a production part approval process, the PPAP process in automotive, it takes, years sometimes to get everything ready for a platform launch. To change suppliers is not, it's very difficult. Oftentimes they'll have two suppliers, but if both those suppliers are in Canada, it'll be very difficult. They'll have to wait for almost a platform change. So in some cases it could take years, but then in other cases, it could go quite quickly, but yes, it's going to have a global, it's going to have a significant shift. John, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Jason's saying, and I think the one thing that really surprised me the most with the action against China was the repealing of the de minimis rule that's been in place for years. That Chinese factories and exporters have been taking advantage of, in particular. And you've got companies like Shein and Temu, just two giants that have built their entire business model on this tariff-free, duty-free. I think it's $800 per shipment. But it's not only these big giants. I think most American direct-to-consumer brands that are in apparel or home goods, et cetera, that are producing from China will be directly impacted immediately if this is repealed. So I think that's something to bear in mind, that if you are in that space and you see this coming down the pike, are you going to be shifting your investments into holding inventory, into warehousing? What other mitigation tactics you can think of in the short term until you can figure out your supply chain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I
well
think they
said.
reinstated the de minimis rule.
They did. It was like
Yeah,
they repealed it for like 3 days or
yeah.
something, and then they brought it back. But that could change anytime. I mean, I thought it was always going to be hands off, but that one really
Yeah.
shocked me.
Simon, the next question is probably good for you. Will these tariffs create opportunities for U.S. manufacturers? And if so, how can we capitalize on them? So lots of capacity in the United States manufacturing sector. How could they capitalize on this change?
That's probably more long term, because short term it's going to be, I imagine, more difficult, simply because, especially if you're, going to sell a lot of goods outside, a stronger dollar is going to have an impact, right? And the dollar's already been going up. It's been going up even before it was going up before the election. It was up about 4 or 5%. But even after the election, because of the tariff issue, the dollar's been going up. That's going to make, that's going to be a headwind for exports, right? Manufactured goods exports. And it ironically makes imports cheaper. So, if anything, the trade deficit is going to get worse. And that's actually what we saw in 2018, 2019. So I don't think it's a great situation from that perspective for US manufacturers. Now, over a longer period of time, maybe as supply chains get rerouted, there's more reshoring as well. But at the same time, you need, we're close to full employment here. We just got the payroll data on Friday for January. The prime age employment population ratio is 80.7%, right? That is higher than at any point in the last two economic cycles. That means I'm not saying there aren't people unemployed. There certainly are, but most people who want to work are working right now, right? We are in a better situation. So the question is, who do you get to, work in these places, in these factories that are reshored, right? So there is that issue. We are in a, close to quote unquote full employment, right? So that is another issue as well. But no, I think it goes back to, with respect to immediate impact, I think it's really manifested. It's hard to figure out, okay, exactly how much prices will go up. But I think where it really matters, it kind of puts the Federal Reserve off in terms of, further away in terms of interest rate cuts, right? Because they are going to be, trying to figure out, okay, what tariffs are going to be imposed on whom? What's the inflationary impact of this? And that means they're going to take even longer to figure out, okay, maybe we should step back from rate cuts, right? That has its own impact on the cyclical economy.
Yes. Edward, what do you think? Do you foresee any legal challenges? Obviously, unions have spoken up on both sides of the border, particularly in Canada. They were quite vocal, and it would be the automotive union. But do you see any legal challenges or policy reversals? And if so, like what kind of impact and how do you guide your clients through these moments of uncertainty? What are some of the things that you suggest they be looking at?
I mean, a tremendous number of his executive orders are facing legal challenges. In the case of tariffs, I think the U.S. president has the right to impose those type of things. So, again, it's going to depend on how long and what kind of transaction or trade deal that he's going to want to do on this type of thing. I think normally the U.S. administration would listen to international organizations, World Trade Organization, others. I don't think this administration is going to pay much attention to international organizations. So any complaints and appeals that are going on, via countries to, World Trade Organization, I think the U.S. is going to largely ignore that. So I don't think, from advising clients, I don't think, you can try to influence and, talk to your congressman, your senator, etc. But I'm not sure you're getting an open ear in D.C. to getting input. I think Trump knows what he wants to do, and his advisors know what they want to do, and I think they're going to march ahead. And we're going to have to, make this play out without the likelihood of an international organization or courts kind of having much impact.
Right. Right. Jason, this next question is probably good for you. What is the long-term impact on trade and currencies for global and trade hubs as well as African markets?
Well, I'll start on kind of the long-term trade and the kind of currency implications. Like part of what's kind of gone on and why the U.S. has a trade deficit, you could partly argue, like, and Sonia touched on this earlier, the dollar has done very well. By a lot of estimates, the U.S. dollar is expensive, and that's certainly hurting U.S. production and the ability to export and make imports cheaper, right? So, you could say, well, that's if we have a cheaper dollar, that would alleviate things. There is a bit of a contradiction, let's be frank about the Trump administration, because Trump has also been out there being adamant, like, we don't want the BRICS countries using anything but the dollar as the currency. So you want the kind of the benefits of the reserve currency status, but also want the lower dollar. So there's a bit of a kind of a challenge there. There's a broader kind of view amongst economists of partly why the U.S. has a trade deficit is that it just reflects that we consume more than we save, and therefore you need to have capital coming into the country to buy U.S. financial assets. Foreign and countries, investors, consumers, therefore, need to export to the U.S. and the U.S. is consuming more, and so partly because the U.S. financial markets, treasuries, equities are the dominant financial assets. It becomes essentially the repository where investors around the world kind of put their assets, and all that's biasing towards the dollar to be stronger. So in order to change all this, it's not just a matter of tariffs, but it's almost like rejiggering, kind of global dynamics, but also frankly domestically. You could say, well, do we have to address the fact that we consume more than we save, and therefore it's kind of changing fiscal policy, which there doesn't seem to be at the moment a clear, cohesive policy of how this is all ties together. So I think for the moment, given how the U.S. is doing on a relative basis better than other parts of the world, given you have higher relative interest rates, given that tariffs, one way that other countries could deal with that is you literally have your currency depreciate, then none of this feels like that it changes in the near term. On a longer term basis, changing those capital flow dynamics, changing the domestic fiscal situation could have impacts there. The people talk about other countries trying to get away from the US dollar as the reserve currency. Much easier said than done, because there's a reason why having one dominant currency sort of kind of lubricates and facilitates a lot of trade. So I think that's the next 10 years, the chances of that happening is quite small. Not zero, but definitely quite small. So it depends when you say long term, like 50 years, sure. Next 10 years, probably not, as you think about kind of your planning, your business. In African countries, I think that's kind of, let's say, like a little bit beyond my skis in terms of what I know exactly, but I think the same general kind of attributes I've described here are applicable. The one thing I'd say about some of the African countries, and it probably ties in with other U.S. policies, but also China policies with their One Belt, One Road initiative. They've done a lot of outreach, a lot of investment. This is China over the past decade. The U.S. has pulled back to some extent and just take it for what it is. But what's kind of gone with U.S. aid in the near term, suggesting that a policy of being curtailing U.S. involvement abroad could diminish the ability for the U.S. on other broader matters to have influence in China and other countries. What I think more than happy to step up. How this plays out, that's again hard to say, but this kind of also goes into these transactional versus strategic approach. The more that the U.S. is sort of transactional and trying to solve one problem here or there versus a broader objective, the more that you have a risk of the U.S. sort of uncoupling in ways that are perhaps less advantageous long term for what the goals are, even if the short term objectives are made. So I think that remains to be seen. Yes, big picture how this is all going to evolve and what the objectives are, but I think that's things to kind of keep in mind, that if this is not strategic, then U.S. influence long term could definitely kind of be undermined, and other players of the world would happily step in.
Yes. Hey, Sana, I'll give you that. I think we can squeeze one more question in here. We've got a few we won't be able to get to, but the next one here is, who do you feel the pain of tariffs will affect the most? Foreign countries, businesses, or consumers?
At first glance, I think on the surface, I would say foreign countries, because they're so dependent on manufacturing. Because here there is, yes, consumers, there may be a bit of inflation, but average inflation, even if it's 30, 40 basis points, right? There may be certain pockets where they feel it. And I think companies likely have room on on their balance sheets to absorb some of those costs too, right? You saw margins already go up. They've been playing that price over volume game over the last few years. So I would say foreign countries more than anything, which is part of the reason they've come to the negotiating table as quickly as they have, as evidenced in Mexico and Canada. Europe, I think, will be a different ballgame. One thing is that Europe is so bureaucratic, and some would say sclerotic to some extent too, with respect to, like, with Canada and Mexico, I think Trump can pick up the phone. There's somebody to talk to. Who do you talk to in Europe? Who do you negotiate with? You're negotiating with a committee, right? So I think that gets to some of the difficulties that will be, that will probably manifest itself sooner rather than later when we start to figure out, okay, what's the end game with Europe over here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And as we sit and talk about it, it's hard to negate the fact that these are very intricate markets, interwoven trading relationships that have a very significant ripple effect across all the industries and their countries. So it's going to have an interesting impact. We'll have to see, obviously, what the final decision is, but there's no doubt it's rolling in a direction that we are going to have to contend with, and it's going to change the sort of the trading relationships for years to come, no doubt. I appreciate that. Appreciate you coming on as my panelist today. Very much appreciate your insight that you provided for us today. If you've enjoyed the conversation and the discussion and you don't have a coach, this is the perfect time to consider one. There's a lot that's coming at you. Even if we end up with another 30-day reprieve, there's just a lot to consider, to work through, to understand how this is going to impact your business and some of the things that you need to do at your strategy and at your execution level of your business. In our Making Big Happen system, we have the ability to really peel down those layers and really help you build out a strategy